There was a peculiar silence recorded in the county's early reports, the kind of silence that, according to old chroniclers, only appears when an entire community tries to forget what it cannot understand. It was this silence that surrounded the Pinewood Ridge case in 1905, a collective disappearance that seemed to linger in the air long after the last searches, and which still remains an open wound in the region's archives. The historian who first gathered the papers called it the shadow of the 48, men who had disappeared in the low hills of the Smoky Foothills after a seemingly trivial visit to the attic of the Pinewood sisters, two reserved young women, known more for their habit of writing long letters than for any social involvement. The community described sisters Clara and Eleanor Pinewood as kind but reclusive, daughters of a carpenter who had died young, leaving them the small wooden house on the edge of the forest and an abandoned workshop that was never completely emptied. At the turn of the century, Pinewood Ridge was a simple village made up of families of farmers, woodcutters, and small craftsmen. The houses had narrow windows, the dirt floors raised fine dust that spread throughout the village when the wind changed direction. Records show that the men there walked a lot. They climbed hillsides to mark their territory, fetched water from higher streams, and traveled along trails that existed only in the memory of those who used them. Life, almost always silent, followed the slow rhythm of the months. It was in this environment of predictable routine that the disappearances began, not all at once, but at small intervals, as if someone were tearing pieces from an old photograph until, in the end, the entire picture fell apart. The first name listed is Samuel Granger, a woodcutter in his early 30s, described as reserved, disciplined, and meticulous. He was last seen leaving his wagon near the Pinewood sisters' house, claiming he needed to get something from the attic, although neither of them confirmed the encounter. Soon after, others followed: neighbors, mill workers, young people who made deliveries between farms, some known to each other, others not. The 1905 documents show a spreadsheet, handwritten in irregular handwriting, listing names, ages, and estimated dates of disappearance. Below, a short comment from some exhausted employee. They all went through the attic. The sisters' attic, as described in later searches, was nothing out of the ordinary. Wooden boxes with old clothes, empty picture frames, forgotten school notebooks, small family objects. Still, it became the last confirmed location where many of those men had been. What led them there, and why different men would have crossed the same door within the same span of weeks, was what made this record one of the most intriguing in the county. Everything begins to take on a more disturbing tone when you read the first letter attached to the case, written by a neighbor who observed the sisters' house from his porch. He noted with perplexity that an unusual number of men would climb up to the attic at dusk, always alone, always in silence. Some would remain inside for minutes, others for almost an hour. None seemed to return in a suspicious manner. They were simply not seen again. The introduction of this enigma into the files has a strange weight. There are no reports of screams, disputes, fights, or even suspicious movement of objects or people. What exists, repeated in different documents, is stillness, the same stillness that dominated the hills when the sun set behind the Smoky Foothills, creating long shadows that slowly swallowed the fences, trails, and dirt roads. As one progresses through the pages, a detail emerges that researchers consider to be the turning point in the case. The last man to disappear, a teacher named Elias Crow, left behind a small notebook. And on one of its final pages, written in a hurry, there is a sentence that became the beginning of the real mystery. In their attic, there is something that doesn't fit in with the rest. The report ends this excerpt with a note from the investigator himself, as if trying to warn those who came after him. Nothing is more disturbing in the county archives than what is not written here. The routine at Pinewood Ridge before the disappearances was a mosaic of small gestures repeated over the years. Gestures that, when observed from a distance, seemed to form a calm and predictable choreography. Mornings always began with the sound of the mill to the south, which marked the start of the county workers' shift. Soon after, The carts headed for the hills to collect firewood and transport supplies. The community lived according to the land, the wood, and the seasons, which dictated the rhythm of each family. The Pinewood sisters lived apart from all this. Clara, the eldest, was known for her writing and organizational skills. Many villagers asked her for help in writing letters, recording inventories, or organizing simple documents. Eleanor, the youngest, preferred sewing, and she was often seen at the monthly fairs selling small towels embroidered with old family initials. The two lived quietly, always discreet, always avoiding getting involved in long conversations. There was nothing about them that suggested turmoil, nothing that foreshadowed their later association with one of the county's greatest mysteries. Accounts of the period leading up to the disappearances describe Pinewood Ridge as a weary place, still recovering from the agricultural difficulties of the previous decade. Many families had lost entire crops due to erratic rainfall. Others struggled to pay back taxes. Community relations were strong, but marked by a kind of silent resignation, the same silence that permeated the cold air of the hills at dawn. It was in this context that the first comments about strange behavior among some of the village men emerged. Later testimonies reveal subtle things. A woodcutter who began walking alone at dusk for no apparent reason. A delivery man who, according to his wife, would sit on the porch staring at the Pinewood Road for long minutes, as if waiting for something. And a young farmer who began missing family meals without explanation. None of this seemed alarming at the time. They were small, almost imperceptible changes, diluted in the harsh and silent routine of the village. Even so, these details were repeatedly mentioned years later, when families tried to reconstruct what could have led each of them, at different times, to the sisters' door. The Pinewoods themselves, according to official records, showed no significant change in their habits. They continued to buy flour, kerosene, and fabric at the same store. They continued to walk together through the markets, unhurried, almost always with their heads down. Some neighbors, however, mentioned something curious. Clara seemed to be always reviewing papers on the porch of the house. They reported seeing her writing much more than usual, stacking notebooks and loose sheets of paper. The contents of these documents were never found. The attic, the future center of the mystery, was rarely accessed before that year. According to a letter from a nephew of the sisters, the structure was old, with fragile beams and uneven floors. There was a smell of damp wood, accumulated dust, and fabric stored for decades. Nothing that suggested an inviting space. Still, for reasons that the archives never fully explain, it began to become the destination of several men from the village. Professor Elias Crow, one of the last to disappear, was one of the few who kept written records of his routine. In his notes from the previous weeks, there are isolated references to the humid weather, the restless behavior of his students, and some quick encounters with residents. In one passage, he mentions talking to Clara Pinewood about cataloging old family books. There is nothing suspicious there, but it is the only passage that connects him directly to the sisters before his last visit to the attic. Another important testimony comes from Joseph Baker, the mill owner. He reported that 3 of the missing men had asked for time off on the same days, citing personal matters. Baker did not believe it was a coincidence, but he also had no evidence to support any accusations. The only thing he repeated in the transcripts of his interview was, "They seemed distracted, as if they were thinking about something else, far away from here." Despite this, daily life in the village continued, and life went on as usual. Children running along the dirt road, women washing clothes in the river, bonfires lit at the beginning of each night. No one imagined that these isolated absences would together form one of the most disturbing episodes in the county. As the list of missing persons grew, albeit slowly and sporadically, the community began to notice a pattern. It wasn't just the coincidence of them having passed through the attic. It was the gradual change in their expressions, reported by relatives and friends, lost looks, hesitation before answering simple questions, a kind of silent discomfort when walking along the trails that led to the hills. There is no clear record of fear among them in the documents, But there is a feeling, repeated in several testimonies, that some of these men seemed divided, as if they were attracted to something they couldn't explain and at the same time afraid to go on. This emotional ambiguity, reconstructed years later by historians, is perhaps the most delicate thread in the case. It is not a collective impulse nor a generalized suggestion, but a set of small cracks in the routine of ordinary people. Details that, in isolation, could be ignored, but together they form the backdrop to the disappearance. The last days before the collective disappearance form a mosaic of cross-referenced, fragmented accounts, some contradictory, others frighteningly consistent. What is known today has been reconstructed from interviews, scattered notes, incomplete letters, and official statements collected by the county. No single document explains what happened, but together they create a disturbing picture of the slow and inevitable pace with which Pinewood Ridge moved toward a night that would never be forgotten. It all begins the week before the final disappearance, when teacher Elias Crow was last seen. According to his school report, Elias had ended class early that day. He briefly mentioned a slight pain in his temples, something common, he said, when the air in the hills became more humid. But one student noticed something the adults did not. The teacher was holding his notebook with his left hand, even though he was right-handed. He seemed distracted, she said decades later, in an interview as an elderly woman, as if he were hearing someone call him, but from inside his own head. In the afternoon, Elias was seen walking toward the Pinewood sisters' house. The sun was low, casting a pale light on the fence rails and narrow trails that crisscrossed the village. According to a neighbor, he walked slowly, not as if he were hesitating, but as if he were lost in distant thoughts. He seemed calm, the man reported, but too calm for someone with the life he had. Minutes later, Elias climbed the 3 steps leading to the Pinewood's porch. Clara opened the door. There are no records of what they talked about. What is known is that, as reported by another neighbor, the attic door was opened shortly thereafter, and slow footsteps could be heard on the upper floor. This neighbor stated that, in the late afternoon, she saw Eleanor Pinewood standing in the yard, staring intently at the attic window, as if she were waiting for something. Investigators never knew for sure how long Elias remained inside. Night fell slowly, bringing with it a cold wind that descended from the Smoky foothills and rustled the surrounding trees. The lamp in the Pinewood house remained lit until after midnight, according to a farmer who returned to the village late at night, but he saw no one else enter or leave. After Elias, there was a sudden increase in activity at the sisters' house. Over the next 2 days, 3 men were seen approaching the residence at dusk. All were known to the village, all were workers, and all appeared calm. None of them were seen leaving the premises. Later records describe this period as the silent succession, when the absences began to follow an almost mathematical pattern. Men who went to the house in the late afternoon, men who went up to the attic, men who did not return. As this pattern took shape, other elements began to emerge in the testimonies, and that is where the case enters its most disturbing phase. Wives and family members reported subtle changes in behavior. A woodcutter who woke up in the middle of the night and sat on the edge of his bed staring at the floor. A delivery man who left food untouched for 2 days. A young man who began writing brief notes on pieces of paper, but always crumpled them up and threw them away. These details, tiny when taken individually, became crucial when pieced together by the county investigator. And then came the night of the final disappearance. The night that would seal the case forever. According to the diary of one of the residents, the weather that night was unusual. The clouds were low and heavy, and the air seemed still, dense enough that the sounds of the village echoed strangely. The mill had been shut down earlier, and the silence that followed was so deep that, according to the diary transcript, it seemed as if the hills were listening. Around 8 o'clock that night, a group of 5 men was seen walking together toward the Pinewood house. This had never happened before. Until then, visits had always been individual. They walked in a line without talking, with firm steps and neutral expressions. One witness said it looked like a procession. Another said they had a fixed gaze, as if following a decision already made. The sisters were at home. The light from the lamp leaked through the attic window, creating a faint strip that cut through the darkness. The wind had stopped completely. One of the neighbors, curious about the commotion, approached from a safe distance, hidden behind a fence. He watched as the men knocked on the door, just once, and Clara opened it. There was no audible conversation. They simply entered. A few minutes later, the upper floorboards creaked. Footsteps in the attic. Time passed slowly. The lamp grew dimmer. The neighbor, according to his testimony, began to feel a kind of uneasiness that was difficult to describe. Not fear, but something close to a silent urgency. He saw no one come downstairs. He heard no discussion. He noticed no sudden movements, only the creaking of the floor, which ceased shortly before midnight. And then, nothing. Total silence. The light off. The night still. One detail, however, turned that night into a milestone in the county's history. Shortly before returning home, the neighbor saw something in the attic window. A shadow moving briefly, as if someone had passed in front of the light coming from inside. But the lamp was already off. The next day, the door to the Pinewood house was found ajar. The sisters were not there. Neither were the men. The attic, despite being the last place anyone had seen them, was perfectly tidy, as if nothing had happened. And in the center of the floor, almost imperceptible under the fine dust, there was only a small pencil mark, like a line interrupted in mid-stroke, a line that Elias Crow would never finish. At dawn, the day after the final disappearance, Pinewood Ridge woke up with a feeling that many residents described as a void in the air. It was as if something had been taken from the village, not just people, but an entire set of routines and expectations. The silence always present in the region now seemed heavier, a silence that did not come from the hills, but from the community itself. The first to notice the men's absence were their own families, who found it strange that they were late starting their morning chores. The mill did not open. The carts did not set out on the trails. The wood stacked in front of the houses remained untouched. Within a few hours, the women began to gather at their doors, exchanging uneasy glances, unable to formulate clear questions. Something was wrong, but they didn't know what yet. The news spread quickly when a neighbor, concerned about the previous night's commotion, decided to check on the Pinewood house. She found the front door ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. She called out the sisters' names. No answer. She entered cautiously, accompanied by 2 residents. The house was tidy, strangely tidy. The table was set, the lamp was cold, and there were no signs of a struggle or a disorderly exit. They went up to the attic. Nothing. No objects were out of place. There were no marks, except for the small pencil mark that had already been noted by the neighbor the night before. And yet, the atmosphere seemed charged with something difficult to name. Not a presence, but an absence that occupied physical space. A void that could be felt even before looking at the floor. The search began that same day, first on the initiative of the families, then with the involvement of county authorities. They combed the trails, the streams, the nearby hills. They looked for footprints, remains of lanterns, tools left behind. Nothing. The forest seemed untouched, as if no one had passed through it that night. Some animals were found restless, especially horses, which were reluctant to approach the denser areas of the hills. But this, according to experts at the time, could be a coincidence. The community, however, saw no coincidence. As the days passed, the silent panic turned into whispers. Women commented on small changes in behavior they had noticed in the men before they disappeared. Distant looks, long periods of silence, a kind of hesitation that had never existed before. Some blamed hard work, others blamed the weather, but many began to connect these signs to the Pinewood attic, which now symbolized the last certainty before the void. It was in this climate of anxiety that rumors arose, not about supernatural phenomena, which were non-existent in the sources of the time, but about human tensions, subtle conflicts, and untold stories. Some said that Clara Pinewood had important documents stored in the attic, perhaps family papers, perhaps financial records involving village residents. Others believed that men went up there to resolve private matters, away from the eyes of the community. None of this has been proven. Still, these rumors revealed more about the fragility of the village than about the case itself. One of the most important elements of the investigation was the discovery of 3 unfinished notebooks in the Pinewood home. The notebooks contained lists of names, many of them missing persons, but no apparent motive accompanied these lists. On some pages there were numbers without context, on others, short, interrupted sentences. Investigators debated for weeks whether these notebooks were mere administrative records or had another purpose. They never reached a conclusion. There was also the testimony of a farmer who lived near the hills. He claimed to have seen, 2 days before the tragedy, one of the missing persons walking alone uphill, without an axe, without tools, without a bag. Something extremely unusual for any resident of the region. "He walked as if he were going to meet someone," said the farmer, "but he walked slowly, as if he already knew the way by heart." This report was recorded, but it did not lead to any concrete clues. As the weeks passed, the official search lost momentum. The hills were searched repeatedly, always without result. The county even considered the possibility that the men had left voluntarily, but this hypothesis did not hold up. They all left behind valuables, tools, essential supplies, and above all, entire families. The idea of a collective and unplanned departure seemed to everyone more unlikely than any other explanation. The Pinewood sisters were never seen again. This made the case even more painful. The community did not know if they were involved, if they were victims, if they had fled in fear, or if they had disappeared in the same way as the men. One final detail, discovered almost a month after the tragedy, reignited the debate. A young man who was helping with the search found a loose sheet of paper a few meters from the house, fallen among the roots. The handwriting was Elias Crow's. The sentence was incomplete but legible. "They didn't gather here by chance." It was the first concrete evidence that there was some connection between the missing people, a connection that he, Elias, seemed to have begun to understand. The county officially closed the case as an unsolved disappearance, but Pinewood Ridge was never the same again. Decades have passed since the Smoky Foothills held the last trace of the men of Pinewood Ridge. The files have aged, some have been lost, others have survived, thanks to the insistence of librarians, historians, and curious individuals who never accepted emptiness as an answer. With each new rereading, however, the same feeling always arose. The story was not complete, and perhaps it was never meant to be. The researcher responsible for the final consolidation of the case wrote a discreet preface on the last folder of the file. It was not a conclusion, nor was it a theory. It was merely an attempt to organize what was left. Disconnected notes, incomplete lists, testimonies marked by selective memory and trauma, interrupted notebooks, and silence, always silence, stitching everything together with an almost invisible thread. He begins by describing how the village has changed over the years. The houses that once housed entire families were sold, abandoned, or demolished. The mill, the center of community life, closed a few years after the disappearance, unable to sustain production with so few workers. The children who experienced the event grew up carrying fragments of memories they did not fully understand. Small scenes stored in their memory as if they were photographs exposed to the sun. The Pinewood house remained standing for some time, albeit empty and condemned to ruin. Trees grew around the porch. The wood in the attic gave way in places. For a long time, the community avoided passing by, as if the place were made not of walls, but of unresolved memories. Not out of suspicion, but out of respect, because of what the human mind does when it tries to survive what it cannot explain. And yet, Pinewood Ridge never completely abandoned its search for understanding. In 1921, a new investigator revisited the case, gathering everything that remained to construct a less fragmented picture. He noted that despite all the uncertainties, there was a recurring thread in the narrative. All the missing persons had made quiet decisions before disappearing, none of them dramatic, none definitive. Small deviations from routine, as if each man had paused before continuing on his way. A pause that, seen today, seems like the beginning of the separation between them and the community. This investigator wrote something that later historians have repeated countless times. What was missing from the documents was not logic, but emotional context, as if there were a parallel story, never recorded, moving between the gaps in the official versions. A story made up of unspoken fears, silent pressures, social expectations, internal conflicts that never made it onto paper. In the absence of physical evidence, only these human gestures remained, minimal, intimate, and insistent. The researcher then turned his attention to the pencil mark found in the attic, simple, short, imperfect. He did not believe it was a symbol, a code, or a deliberate mark. For him, that mark was an interrupted gesture. Elias Crow's last attempt to record something he couldn't formulate. An idea that escaped him the moment he tried to capture it. Perhaps a conclusion, perhaps a warning. Perhaps just the final hesitation of someone who, in his last hours, was looking at loose pieces that didn't fit together. He wrote, "Sometimes the first thing to disappear is the word." This thought guided his analysis for decades to come. Because when the word disappears, so does the bridge that connects a person to the world. And Pinewood Ridge, in losing its men, lost exactly that. Its bridges. It was left with too many questions, too few answers, and an archive that always seemed to lead to the same place. The silent attic of the Pinewood sisters. In the 1930s, now elderly, this researcher returned to the hills one last time. He walked slowly, with a new notebook in his hands, trying to revisit the places mentioned in the reports. The trails had changed. Vegetation had covered old paths. Some houses had been swallowed up by time. But when he arrived at the ruins of the Pinewood house, he did something he never officially recorded. He climbed the remaining steps and went inside. There was no furniture, no boxes, no concrete traces of what had happened decades earlier. Just the space, empty, open, and the worn wood of the floor. He looked at the corners, at the light coming through the cracks, at the dust suspended in the air. And for the first time since he had begun his research, he stopped looking for answers. Because there, in that attic, he understood something that documents would never be able to explain. Certain stories don't end because they can't end. They remain in suspension, like a sentence that loses its last word, like a letter that never reached its destination. Pinewood Ridge didn't just lose men. It lost the thread that tied its own narrative together. And, faced with this unbroken silence, the researcher closed his notebook. He took a slow breath. He walked to the door. And before descending the steps, he looked one last time at the empty attic. The last sentence in the file is his, written with the trembling hand of someone who knew he was ending a cycle that would never be completed. Some disappearances do not hide a truth, only a silence that no one can break through.